Well, welcome to our video class on understanding business cycles under our macroeconomic analysis. Let's take a quick look at what we're up against here. In this particular reading, we've got, what, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9? Yeah, it might be 9 learning outcome statements that we're going to address here. And most of it's not too bad. We start out with describing business cycles. The second learning outcome statement having to do with resource use, housing sector activity, and how the external trade sector is affected by business cycles. It's a little bit involved. Then we've got the theories of the business cycle, but after we get through that, it's all downhill, because then we've just got the types of unemployment and some of the measures and statistics that are used in reporting unemployment. Talk about inflation, disinflation, and deflation. We'll take a look at some of the indexes and some of the trade-offs, shortcomings, limitations of these indexes of inflation. And then we'll talk about cost push and demand pull inflation using our aggregate demand, aggregate supply equilibrium model. And then lastly, we'll talk about economic indicators. So let's make it through that, and let's start off with our picture of the business cycle. I believe it's animated and just excellent. There it is. We're moving through the business cycle. We just reached a trough, now a peak. Now we're in a contraction, a recession, the trough, and then back. So where it says average there, that's our trend line of economic growth. Notice what's on the axes. We've got real output of goods and services here, real GDP, and just moving through time. Now, this looks all nice and normal and regular, but remember, these peaks and troughs, they vary quite a bit, right? How bad's the recession, and how long's the recession? How big was the expansion? How long was the expansion? So these time periods and how far they're deviating, the amplitude of these cycles, those are both highly variable, even though we show them here as if they were very regular and well behaved. So if I can get the next button on this thing, I know I can. What happens to the inventory sales ratios? Well, let's read through this, and then we'll go back and take a look at that. Early in a contraction, okay, so it's just turned. We're just heading into a contraction. Sales slow. This is unexpected, right? We're in an expansion. We think things are going fine. We're ramping up inventory. We're increasing sales, and then sales fall off. Well, what happens? Well, inventories build up because we're selling less than we expected as sales go down. So this inventory to sales ratio increases to above normal levels as we move into a contraction. Early in an expansion, coming out of a trough, we have just the opposite effect. We've got inventories down, sales have been down, the economy's been down, and we're just not making that much more stuff, and then sales rise. Well, what happens? This draws down inventories. Inventories go down just as sales are increasing. So our inventory sales ratios decrease. Now, this isn't a huge point, but let's make sure you have it down here. Let's go back here, and where's my pen tool? There we go. Okay, so we're just coming up on a peak, right? And sales slow. So this is where sales over here, I can't write that small. I'll just put S goes down. There, that'll do it. Sales go down. We've been building up inventory, so these inventory to sales ratios are going to start to increase as we reach the peak and move into the contraction. And down here at the bottom at the trough, just the opposite effect. As sales pick up, inventories get drawn down, and this inventory to sales ratio rises as we move into the expansion. So, what happens to labor and capital utilization? Well, the key to understanding this labor and capital utilization is kind of a stickiness, right? Just think of companies as being slow to lay people off and slow to hire full-time employees. And I think that'll help you keep this clearly in mind, what's going on. So at the beginning of a contraction, sales fall. Well, both labor and capital are used less intensively. There's a statistic that comes out, manufacturing hours worked per week. That would be an example of the intensity with which we're using labor. Sorry, easy for you to say. At the beginning of an expansion, remember, sales are increasing. So it's that change in sales that's really driving both these last effects we've talked about, the inventory sales ratio and this utilization. So at the beginning of an expansion, okay, we've been in a recession, there have been layoffs, the labor force is cut down, now sales increase. Well, now we have people working more. We're going to use that labor more intensely. And capital, it's the same story. We're slow to invest in new capital coming out of a recession because the results just haven't been that good. You're not that excited about the future. And when we've invested in assets during an expansion, well, they're not just going to sell off assets because we've moved into a different phase of the business cycle. So intensive use through the beginning going into an expansion, and less intensive use as we move into a contraction. So looked at that way, it's not that hard to remember. And when sales trends persist, if we've got a long, persistent recession, then firms are going to adjust, and so that's what causes this other effect coming out of the trough into the expansion. Now, I believe we said we were going to talk about some housing and the external trade sector. Let's see if that's coming up. Here's the housing sector. So here we just want you to learn some of the things that run the activity in the housing sector. One, it's a very cyclical part of the economy. During expansions, housing sector does well, lots of sales, prices rising, etc. And during a contraction, housing activity slows way down, less permits being issued, less houses being built, less sales being made. So what determines this activity during expansions and contractions? Well, one is mortgage rates. As rates go up, housing activity tends to go down, right? Because houses are mostly bought with mortgages. And so the interest rates on mortgages are a real cost of buying a house. Certainly affects your monthly payment for a given priced house. So mortgage rates up, housing activity down. Incomes up, housing activity up. Now there is some speculation in the housing sector, and sometimes as we've had an expansion for a while, people get the belief that housing prices are going to continue to go up and continue to go up. Well, if you believe they're going to continue to go up, that spurs buying activity, which in turn puts prices up for a while. But it could end badly, as it did in 2008, after that big expansion in housing prices due to a lot of speculation. Another thing to remember about the housing sector is the demographics, household formations, right? And I think in the U.S. right now, as I'm recording this, we're going into a phase where family formations are later in life for many of the current generation in their 20s to early 30s. So it's not just the demographics in terms of age groups, but there may be some other shifts in behavior as well. But now, as you get a big part of the population moving into retirement and past those child-raising years, they may be moving into smaller homes. There may be changes from that as well. So just a point that demographics, household formation, retirements, downsizing, all of that can affect the housing sector directly and be related to the business cycle as well. Now, the external trade sector, we're talking about our exports and our imports. Now, imports we think are determined primarily, and let me say, before I get into these first two bullet points, let me say that we're saying, okay, holding exchange rates constant, then import demand is going to be driven by domestic incomes and depend on the domestic business cycle. So during the expansions, we would expect imports to increase. During contractions in the domestic economy, we would expect imports to decrease. Now, for given exchange rates, on the other hand, exports are going to be determined by foreign incomes and foreign business cycles. And these can be independent of domestic business cycles. Now, as the economy has become more globally, more interrelated, some of these business cycles have started to be not so independent, but they certainly can be. And we say that exports are determined by foreign income. So when foreign incomes increase, they've got an economic expansion going on, say in the Eurozone, then they would be buying more goods from the U.S., our exports would go up. Now, both imports and exports are influenced by currency exchange rates, and we have a couple of readings on international economics coming up where we'll discuss that in some detail. But as a preparation for that and to satisfy the required knowledge for this learning outcome statement, we say, well, if the domestic currency appreciates, imports go up and exports go down. Now, what do we mean by appreciates? Well, let's take the simple example of the price in dollars of a euro. So let's say euros are $1.35 per, I'll make the little euro sign here maybe. Okay, so what do we mean? Domestic currency appreciates. Well, if the dollar appreciates, the price of a euro goes down. So that means imports, euro-priced goods from the Eurozone are going to look cheaper, look less expensive if this rate goes down here, this exchange rate goes down, and the U.S. dollar appreciates. And our exports, however, would go down because to a euro-based investor, U.S. products are going to look more expensive. They're going to cost more euros. So when the domestic currency appreciates relative to a foreign currency, imports tend to go up and exports tend to go down. Now, with a currency depreciation, we're going to have just the opposite effect. So if you can get the one effect right, you'll have the other one right. So let me just cross out my arrow here. And for currency depreciation, that means the dollar price of a euro is going to go up. Euro goods look more expensive, so imports go down. And U.S. goods look less expensive in euros, and exports go up. So that's what you need here about the external trade sector. Now, what about business cycle theories? Well, this looks pretty daunting, but it's not that bad. What we've got on our little table here is different schools of thought that are brought up in the CFA curriculum readings. Then we've got, under that school of thought, what's the cause of business cycles, and what's the recommendation, what to do or not to do. So let's divide this up. This first one, neoclassical. The neoclassical economists here, and let's just cut that off to its own bit there, that it's different rates of technological change over time. Now, if we go back before that, remember, in agrarian economies and for a long, long time, technological change was not thought of as being a real driving force of anything. But then we got to the Industrial Revolution, and we got steam engines, we got automobile engines, we got electricity, and now over the last decades, the pace of technological change has just become, well, fairly well astounding, except we've learned to expect it, I guess, and expect rapid technological change, which can have a big effect on the productive power of an economy. But anyway, enough of the history lesson. The neoclassical economists said, well, technology, sometimes it advances really rapidly, sometimes not so rapidly, and consumer demand, aggregate demand is moving out, maybe steadily, and so these economic cycles, these business cycles, are driven by the rate of technological change. And what's the recommended policy? Just allow wages and prices to adjust, right? If we're at over full employment, wages will go up. We'll get back to regular potential GDP on the aggregate supply curve. And on the other hand, if we go into a recession, wages, prices fall, this stimulates activity, and we get back to full employment. So it's really self-correcting. So the neoclassical economists thought this was self-correcting. Well, what about the Keynesians, and who is Keynes, and what's going on with these next two, Keynesian and new Keynesian schools of economic thought? Well, Keynes's work, remember, it was motivated by the Great Depression in the U.S. in the late 20s, I guess, early 30s, early to mid-30s. And so we had very persistent output below full employment or potential GDP. Unemployment remained high. The economy stagnated. And so Keynes wanted to explain this because the neoclassical economists said, hey, let wages and prices adjust. We'll be back to full employment in no time. Don't worry about this depression. Well, Keynes came up with a reasoning as to why this underproduction was long-lived. And he said, you know what it is? The neoclassical folks said wages and prices were going to adjust. And Keynes said, you know, these wages are sticky. They're not adjusting. So what can we do? What's the recommended policy? Well, the recommended policy under Keynes was to use either fiscal or monetary policy, either government spending or growth of the money supply, to stimulate the economy, shift aggregate demand, and get back to full employment. And the new Keynesians say the same thing, except they said, well, there were some other input prices that for various reasons are also downward sticky. So when we fall into a recession, what can we do? Same prescription. So bundle these two together. The only difference between the Keynesian and the new Keynesian is Keynes said wages were downward sticky, and they were running this whole show. And the new Keynesian says, well, energy prices might be a little sticky too. Other important inputs. Labor is a very important input into the productive process, but there are others as well. So the new Keynesians allowed for the fact that those might be a little sticky too, and wouldn't adjust downward in order to stimulate the economy and get us back to full employment. So you've got those straight. Now we've got three on this graph, and then we're done with theories of the business cycle. The monetarists. Well, the monetarists are all about money, all about the money supply. And that should be enough to inform you as to the causes and recommended policy. The causes are inappropriate changes in money supply growth rate as the monetary authority, as the government messes around with the money supply, trying to do things with the economy, they screw it up. This is what the monetarists believe. What's the recommended policy? Grow the money supply at a steady, predictable growth rate. It should grow along with the economy. If the economy is growing at 3% a year, grow the money supply at 3% a year. Takes a little larger money supply to, support a larger economy, but that's it. So they say don't mess around with the money supply. You're just going to mess things up. That's what the monetarists believe. Now, the Austrians, I don't want to characterize Austrians as how to remember this. I don't know that many Austrians. But they think the cause of the business cycle is government intervention in the economy. And the recommended policy is don't intervene in the economy. Well, it really brings home what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years. Is don't force interest rates to artificially low levels. Well, at the point I'm recording this, the broad consensus is that interest rates are at very low levels, and we've just recently seen some 30-year lows in interest rates. And so the Austrians, what do they say? You shouldn't really have done this. You know, you've got artificial interest rates. This is going to mess up the economy. It's going to lead to worse business cycles, and they say that it's government that causes it. Monetarist, money supply government. Okay? Austrian, kind of the same thing when you look at it. So maybe we can group those kind of together. And the last one here, New Classical, which is RBC, Real Business Cycle Theory. Well, real business cycle theory is saying that, well, these business cycles are a real phenomenon. Remember, when we're talking about the money supply, we're talking about controlling interest rates, these are monetary variables. They are not real. Real is like actual production and things like this. So these real business cycle theory folks think that these business cycles are rational economic responses to external shocks and changes in technology. And the recommended policy, don't intervene to counteract business cycles. So we started out with don't need to intervene, ended up with a couple of don't intervenes, actually the last three. Keynes and New Keynesian were the ones that said intervene with monetary and fiscal policy. So hopefully those explanations will allow you to keep these a little bit straight by their names. Okay, our next topic here, moving right along, our next topic here, we're going to define some things. Frictional unemployment. When there's friction, you know, you tell your boss you hate the looks of him, and there's some friction, well, you're looking for a new job. That's frictional unemployment. It's really the time it takes employers and employees to find each other in the economy. There's people looking for work that have the required skills. There's businesses looking for workers that have those skills, but still it takes some time to match up. People move, they change jobs, and as I was joking about, just can't stand their boss or can't stand the work or whatever it is. Okay? Or maybe the boss can't stand the worker. That's happened before as well, and maybe sometimes it's just mutual. Well, anyway, that's frictional unemployment. The difference with structural unemployment is the skills don't fit the jobs. So if you've got a lot of textile manufacturing moving outside the U.S., you've got a lot of skilled textile manufacturers down in North Carolina or South Carolina, somewhere down there, and now the jobs are in healthcare, the jobs are in financial services, the jobs are in other parts of the economy, and they don't have the requisite skills. That's structural unemployment. Now, they can retrain, they can learn new skills, and this will be solved over time. But that's the difference between frictional, skills match skills, but they need to get together. Structural, skills don't match skills, so there has to be some training in the economy to get that skills gap closed. Now, the last type of unemployment here is cyclical, and that's the business cycle one. Unemployment results from changes in economic growth. Now, notice we say cyclical unemployment is zero at full employment, but right there, I want to emphasize that. But that doesn't mean that unemployment is zero at full employment. Frictional unemployment and structural unemployment are always with us. And maybe that runs as high as 3%. So maybe at an unemployment rate of 3%, we say, well, we are at full employment. Cyclical unemployment is zero. The other thing to note about cyclical unemployment is it can be positive or negative. Frictional unemployment, let's call that positive. Structural unemployment, that's positive. They're never below zero. But if we get to over full employment during an economic expansion, we could say, well, cyclical unemployment is negative. So we've got frictional and structural equal to 3%. And if cyclical unemployment, if it was over full employment, 1%, we'd see the actual unemployment rate at, I almost wrote a 5, at 2%. Okay. So cyclical unemployment, positive or negative, at full employment it's zero. Frictional and structural unemployment, always with us, even at what we call full employment. Let's get some other terms here locked down. Now, what do we mean when we say someone's unemployed? Just that they don't have a job? No, that's not good enough. They must be available for work and actively looking for work to be counted as unemployed. When we talk about the labor force, we're talking about all those who are employed and those who are available and actively looking for work, the unemployed. So employed plus unemployed equals the labor force. The unemployment rate is simply the number of unemployed divided by the number in the labor force. So it's the percentage of the labor force that's currently seeking work and available for work, but not working. This participation ratio is the labor force to the working age population. Might be the working age population outside of prison, but depends on how it's defined, I guess. In general, the participation ratio just says, well, what percentage of the working age population are either actively seeking employment or employed? That's the labor force. And we see sometimes this participation ratio fall, and it's been falling over time lately. And one thing that causes that to fall is discouraged workers. If you've got a worker who's available for work and been looking for work, but just can't find it, and after 6 months just says it's not even worth the trouble to look, that's a discouraged worker. So now, not actively seeking employment, not part of the labor force anymore, so discouraged workers, labor force goes down, working age population still the same, participation ratio goes down. So maybe that will help you remember and understand that term. So now our inflation terms. What's inflation? Well, it's a persistent increase in the price level over time. But when we talk about the inflation rate, we're usually talking about the last quarter or the last year or what's it been. Now, when we talk about disinflation, that's a decrease in positive inflation over time. So if inflation's been running at 4%, the policymakers are trying to bring it down, and it goes down to 3% and 2%, that's disinflation. Deflation is quite a different thing, which is why I put it in red here. It's a decrease in the price level over time, a negative inflation rate. And for reasons we won't discuss here, policymakers, economists think that this deflation, you really don't want to have that. Hyperinflation refers to out of control, high inflation. You've probably read some of the stories in wartime economies, other economies. It usually has to do with printing an awful lot of money, but it can get to where the inflation is just escalating out of control, 20% a year, 40% a year, 100, 3,000% a year. That's your hyperinflation, and that's very destructive to an economy and its productivity and its finance and banking systems as well. So that's to be avoided along with deflation. Well, how are we going to measure this inflation? Well, we measure it with a price index. Our first bullet here says a price index is a weighted average of goods and services prices compared to a base period. It's used as a proxy for the overall or average price level or average increase in the price level if we're looking at two different dates. So we start with a base period, 1980. And we take and we say, well, here's a little housing, here's a little automobile, here's a little food, here's a little energy, here's a little this, here's a little that. So we've got what we call this basket of goods. And then each period you go out and you say, okay, how much does this basket of goods cost? And that's it. And you look at the percentage change in what that basket of goods costs over time. And that's your CPI in the U.S., Consumer Price Index. So they start with a fixed basket of goods and services, and they just compare the cost over time to that in a base period. Well, it's an index, so you put it to 100. Let me show you on this next slide here. I think we've got a calculation for you to help with that. Yeah, well, it's kind of a calculation. It's an illustration anyway. Okay, so first we find the cost of the basket in the base period. So we find out, well, in the base period it was $2,500. That's what all these goods and services cost. Now we take the same basket at current prices and say, well, what's it cost now? Well, in our example, it now costs $2,900. So that's 29 over 25, and we just multiply it by 100 as our scalar. So the CPI in the base year is set to 100, and whenever this period is, that index number has risen to 116. Well, that tells us since the base period, prices on average, or I should say the prices of these goods in our fixed basket, are up 16% over the period. So that's our proxy measure for inflation. And that's our published inflation rate. Now there's some other indexes that are used. There's a price index for personal consumption expenditures, and this is based on a survey of businesses instead of consumer prices. There's something called the GDP deflator, which is gets us from nominal to real GDP, discussed in another reading in a little more detail. And the producer price index in the U.S., the PPI, is based on the prices of things producers use: crude materials, intermediate goods, and some finished goods prices. The producer price index is thought, at least the way I was trained, that it should show inflation before it gets to the consumer level. Well, that's got some nice sense to it, right? That if the prices of energy, oil, raw materials, metals, and intermediate goods going into other finished goods are going up, then we could kind of expect the prices of consumer goods to go up shortly thereafter. So that's the PPI. But the one we're most focused on is the CPI. That's the one that affects us most. Now, when I said we see that's the inflation we see, that CPI, sometimes we call that headline inflation because it ends up in the headlines of the paper. CPI up such and such annual rate, usually over the last quarter, an annualized rate, or maybe the trailing 12 months. When we talk about core inflation, we exclude food prices and energy prices. And the reason they exclude those in reporting core inflation is that they're volatile. Energy prices can be volatile, food prices can be volatile. They're not just changing with overall economic activity over time. So when we exclude food and energy prices, we say we've got core inflation. Sometimes core inflation is used by policymakers in determining their policy response to the rate of inflation in the economy. As we'll talk much more about later when we talk about monetary policy, the rate of growth of the money supply is often based on a target rate of inflation. And more often than not, they'll use this core rate of inflation to determine whether the inflation in prices in the economy is greater or less than the target rate of inflation, which is typically positive, often around 2%. Okay, so now we've got our inflation measures. We know how they're measured. We know what they're used for to some extent. What are some of the limitations? Well, for our purposes here, the CPI is widely believed to overstate the true rate of inflation. And the arguments that support this claim that it overstates the true rate of inflation is that we've got this fixed basket. And there's no substitution. Now, typically, if something in the economy gets more expensive on a relative basis, consumers will shift their consumption toward a substitute good, just like we talked about in our microeconomics. So, if the price of orange juice goes way up, you'll see people drinking grapefruit juice, or they'll drink apple juice. Not all of them and not all the time, but that's the substitution you make. Well, when we have a fixed basket of goods, that's just not the case. So since we use the same quantities, no matter what happens to the price levels, we're not looking at the benefits in terms of expenditures of substitution in the consumption mix of consumers. Another reason it's believed to overstate the true rate of inflation is that new goods replace older, lower-priced products, and often that's tied with this last bullet point there, price increases due to quality improvements. So I have a hard time separating those, but maybe you can't. But you think about automobile prices, transportation, built into this CPI. Well, cars have gone up more than the overall rate of inflation. But they've also become safer, quality improvements. They last longer, they require less maintenance, and they actually give you better performance along the way, lower gas mileage, so your cost there has gone down. Well, none of this is reflected in that methodology that they use for the CPI. So that's our story, and we're sticking to it. The CPI overstates the rate of inflation because it doesn't allow for substitution in response to changing relative prices. New goods are in there, and price increases due to quality improvements. So the CPI goes up, but it's not all price increases. You're getting better quality products. So these are the arguments there. So how are we going to adjust for this? Now, this is a point where I say don't let this stuff overwhelm you, and don't drill down. Don't get very complicated with this. The CPI, that way we've described doing it with a fixed basket of goods, that's called a Lesper's index. A Posh index is different. How is it different? It uses basket weights from the current period and compares the cost to the base period. So with that Lesper's index, we kept everything in the basket fixed. Now we're going to let the composition of the basket, consumption patterns in the current period. So now we've allowed for substitution. And there's something called a chained price index, which is just the geometric mean of these two. And that's less biased. That's all I want you to take away from this slide. Lesper's index, fixed basket. Posh index, composition of the basket changes over time. Chained price index, average of the two. Geometric average, but an average nonetheless. I think that's all you can be expected to take away from this. There's certainly not a lot of detail and example where we'd have any calculations or anything else to know. So know that a chained price index helps reduce this upward bias in the CPI. An example of that's the Fisher index. A Posh index has changing weights, and a Lesper's index has fixed weights. If you can remember all that, you'll be in good shape on this learning outcome statement. Okay, what are some factors that affect price levels? Well, this is very elementary stuff here, and for what it's worth, it's named well, so you shouldn't have too much trouble. We're going to say that there's two kinds of inflation, cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. Well, either way, we're getting upward push on the price levels, usually through some sort of monetary policy, monetary stimulus. And we're really just talking about how that process starts. Cost push, and wages are a cost, sometimes called wage push inflation. That's going to drive up prices. Demand pull inflation, we get aggregate demand. We increase it. So we've got a short-term equilibrium above full employment. then that's going to put upward pressure on wages and other input prices, etc. So let's take a look at how this looks on our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. So here we've got our price level over here, we've got real output of goods and services down here, and we are in an equilibrium situation on our short-run aggregate supply curve, our long-run aggregate supply curve, and here's aggregate demand. So here's how cost-push inflation starts. Costs went up. So what happened? This aggregate supply decreased. It moved to the left. Well, remember on this graph, we're holding, when we draw a short-run aggregate supply curve, we're holding input prices constant. Now we're saying, well, what if those input prices went up? Well, if those input prices go up, then at each price level, manufacturers, producers are willing to produce less because their input costs have gone up. So that's what shifted that short-run aggregate supply curve from SRS1 over to SRS2. So now where's our equilibrium? Well, it's thrown us into a recession. One of the examples of this is back in the early 70s when OPEC got together and raised oil prices somewhat dramatically in a short period of time, shoving the U.S. economy, which was much more dependent on energy — we didn't use it as efficiently back then — much more dependent on energy. So that reduced short-run aggregate supply. So now here we are. Here is our short-run equilibrium right here. Now, we could just wait for the price level to fall, but that's not usually what happens, right? People are out of work, unemployment goes up, people don't have jobs, they're getting upset, and the politicians say we better do something. Well, that something they do is use fiscal or monetary policy, like the Keynesians recommend, to shift aggregate demand. So now we're going to move along this new short-run aggregate supply based on the new input prices to a new equilibrium. But now we can see what's the total effect of that. Well, it's all turned into a price level effect. Then prices go up. Then OPEC says, well, look, $30 a barrel just doesn't cut it anymore. We're going to change things and go to $35 a barrel. And then we could repeat this process, this cost-push process, over time. But I just wanted to emphasize that cost-push was the reason it started. The reason it may continue is because rather than letting all prices adjust and putting up with the political consequences of that, and maybe real human and economic consequences as well, that the governmental authorities, the monetary authorities, or the Congress, whoever's running the fiscal policy, shifted that aggregate demand curve up. So we got a little inflation from the cost push, and then we got some more from the government response. Now let's look at demand pull. Here again, we're starting at a situation of full employment equilibrium, right? Our long-run aggregate supply, that's full employment GDP. Cyclical unemployment, 0. And so now with demand pull, we get an inappropriate change in fiscal or monetary policy that shifts aggregate demand out like that. This increases real GDP above full employment GDP and increases prices in the process a little bit. But now we don't need any further government action to mess things up, because now we're over full employment. There's going to be upward pressure on wages and other important inputs, such as energy. As those input prices rise, well, that's going to decrease short-run aggregate supply. We'll move along this new aggregate demand line back to equilibrium, resulting in another price increase, and back to full employment. Now, we call that full employment or potential real GDP because we cannot get past there just by fooling around with stuff. Remember that long-run aggregate supply depends on the availability of labor, capital, and technology in the economy. So we're not going to change that just by fooling with the money supply, fooling with interest rates, or having the government spend more money and tax us some more. So in the long run here, there isn't anything real that's changed. The only thing that's changed in our long run here is the price level. And we've managed to get back to long-run aggregate supply, back to full employment equilibrium. Okay, this is just definition here. Nehru, it's not one of those little jackets with the funny collars from back in the 60s. Nehru is the lowest unemployment rate that will not induce wage push inflation. The non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So the rate of unemployment that won't accelerate the inflation rate. Sometimes called the natural rate of unemployment. Now, whatever this rate is, it likely varies over time and across countries. And remember, it's not the same as full employment. We've already defined that. This natural rate of unemployment or non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment is different than that because there may be wage pressures in economic segments. Maybe there's not enough IT people. Maybe there's not enough nurses or healthcare professionals. So we'll see wage inflation there that can lead to other inflation, even as we have kind of underemployment in some other industries. So that's why it's not the same as full employment. We can see upward wage pressures in some industries, while others maybe should have downward wage pressures, but in fact don't because wages are downward sticky. And there are political and reputational consequences involved. Okay, the last part of this reading, and trust me, we're just about done, and I've got some real good news for you. This is the last learning outcome statement for this reading, and it says, describe economic indicators, including their uses and limitations. There used to be another one last year. In previous volumes of the curriculum, the last one said, given the behavior of indicators, figure out where the economy is in the business cycle. Well, this one has been removed, so we can take that as a clear signal. You don't need to know that for the exam, the current version of the exam. Okay. And all we have to do is describe economic indicators. What are they used for and what are their limitations? Well, we can do that, and we're going to divide these economic indicators into three groups: leading, coincident, and lagging. And all that has to say is where the peak in the indicator is relative to the peak in the economy. If the indicator peaks before the economy peaks, so the indicator goes up and it starts to turn down before the economy starts to turn down, it's a leading indicator. They're turning points, and whether it's the peak or the trough, their turning points tend to precede the turning points in the business cycle. Some of these are weekly hours for manufacturing workers. Stock prices are leading indicators. The yield curve, that is, the shape of the relationship between interest rates and maturity. Learn a lot more about that in our fixed income study session. Building permits, consumer expectations. All of these tend to turn before the business cycle does. The way I read the LOS, what you need to know is that's what a leading indicator is. There's certainly no indication here that you should memorize all these. If you're going to look at two of these, I'd look at unemployment insurance claims. They tend to get better before we see the really getting better in the economy. And stock prices. The stock market tends to predict recessions and predict expansions by changing earlier, as it should if those prices anticipate future profits and future profitability. So those are some leading indicators. Now you know what a leading indicator is. Let's take a look at some coincident indicators. These coincide with the peaks and troughs. Employees on non-farm payrolls. Well, that makes sense, right? These kind of make sense because as you get to a peak in the economic cycle, you've got all the employees you are, and then what happens? It falls off, right? Your labor utilization and capital utilization rates fall off. Okay? Your inventory to sales ratio goes up. Personal income peak with the economy. The amount of industrial production, that makes sense, peaks with GDP. And manufacturing sales and trade sales also peak. So these are things that we would expect to peak at the same time and bottom out at the same time as the overall economy, as our economic cycle. Lagging indicators, the peaks and troughs in these are after the peaks and troughs in the business cycle. The unemployment rate is a lagging indicator. So the economy starts to get better, and 6 months later, I'm just making that up for the lag, 6 months later, the unemployment rate starts to go down. So the prime rate, loans are a lagging indicator, inventory sales ratio, and duration of unemployment. How long has the average unemployed person been unemployed? So those are some indicators we look at. That's what leading, coincident, and lagging means. And what are they used for? Well, they're used to try and figure out where we are in the economic cycle. That's the uses, right? We look at all these various indicators and say, well, the coincident ones are here, the leading ones are here, the lagging ones are here. Try and figure out where we are in the economic cycle. And that can determine not only business response, but also policy response if they're trying to manage the business cycles through monetary and fiscal policy. What are the limitations? Well, they never all line up, and sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes they change over time. So that ought to be enough limitations to get you through. So that wraps up our business cycles reading here. And what else can I say? Happy studying. Enjoy your economics.